format for tonight. It's basically very straightforward. It's just going to be a very casual dialogue with our guest. And we're going to talk about crime fiction, mystery fiction, New York City, and any related topics. If you have any questions for Rich, you can put them in the chat dialog box, and I'll monitor them as we go forward. So now that that's concluded, let me introduce our guest for tonight. It was said by someone, perhaps James Joyce himself, that if Dublin were ever destroyed, it could be rebuilt from the pages of James Joyce's books. I would argue that if New York City were ever destroyed, it could be rebuilt from the pages of Rich Zahradnik's Coleridge Taylor Mystery series, such an important role the city plays in his novels. The 4 books in the series, all available from Camel Press, bring 1970s New York City to life, vivid descriptions, characters, and dialogue. The protagonist is investigative reporter Coleridge Taylor, who roams the streets in search of the story, always against the gritty backdrop of New York City and the actual issues and events of the time period. And not only does New York City find itself in precarious situations, so does Mr. Taylor himself frequently. Before he created Coleridge Taylor, Rich was a journalist for 27 years, working as a reporter, editor at several different media, online, newspaper, broadcast, magazine, and wire services. He held editorial positions at CNN, Bloomberg News, AOL, and The Hollywood Reporter. Rich started his first job in journalism at the Peekskill Evening Star in January 1983, and he and 2 colleagues started the Peekskill Herald in 1986. I think that with Regina Carpenter and Kathy Daly. Rich received his BA in journalism and political science from George Washington University. He lives with his wife Sherry and son Patrick in Pelham, where he writes fiction and teaches kids throughout the New York area how to produce news stories and publish newspapers. He's also providing guidance to the Pelham Examiner, the first community newspaper owned and operated by student shareholders. Please join me in welcoming to Peekskill, or should I say welcoming back to Peekskill, Rich Zahradnik. Welcome, Rich.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that great introduction. I may be made speechless by the comparison to James Joyce. I want to say the story before the story. Dan, I appreciate everything you've done from the invitation you made more than a year ago, last February, before we were all beset by COVID, and returning to this idea and doing it virtually now. I am sitting in Peekskill. I'm at the Birdsall House in Peekskill, actually.
Oh, fantastic.
The reason I am sitting in Peekskill is, I've done a bunch of these. I've had book launches. I go to the big mystery conventions. I've done panels, all that kind of stuff. But this was and is a homecoming for me. As you said, my first newspaper job was with the Evening Star. 9 months out of college, because I spent 3 months in Europe. And my first entrepreneurship thing, if you want to call it that, was as a co-founder of the Peekskill Herald. So, I mean, obviously people have suffered a great deal more from COVID, but I really could not do my Peekskill homecoming sitting in my home. So the people here at Birdsall House have been great. They turned the speaker off, it's just above me, so you're not hearing heavy metal. I had dinner with Regina and a friend of hers, and they left so they could be on this call. Right. And so I am here with you in Peekskill, ready for questions.
All right, fantastic. We all know the Birdsall House is a great place. I've been there many times. So I just want to begin generally by asking, after almost 3 decades in journalism, what led you to start writing mystery and crime fiction?
Okay, and I did not plan this. I absolutely did not plan this. Today I went, in case, and they're over in my briefcase, so I may not pull them out, but in case it came up, I pulled out the file folder that holds my Evening Star, Peekskill Evening Star clips. Tells you a lot about a journalist that I would have them after all this time. But in that same box of file folders, I found the first crime story I attempted, which was somewhere in late junior high school to high school. Now, the reason that's important is because when I was about 15, I was going to be a writer, a creative writer, if you will, but writers are all creative. And when I was 15 and a half, I decided I wasn't talented enough. I wasn't good enough. So be afraid of what 15 and a half year olds do, decisions they make. And I wrote a letter to the editor of the local paper It got my name on it. It got a school board member pissed off at me. I got phone calls. I got people reading it. I'm like, this journalism thing looks good. And so I went into journalism. Then you fast forward to, about 15 years later, I'm 31 years old. And the best way I could put it is the stories kept coming into my head. And I don't mean the journalistic stories, but the ones that you're making up. And I was a big crime fiction reader. I mean, most crime fiction writers talk about going all the way back to Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys, Sherlock Holmes. I was a big crime fiction reader from my earliest reading days, also a science fiction fan, loved crime. And so I sat down way back then and started. It was a pretty long journey from then and to get published, but that was how and why.
Now, did your background in journalism influence what you wrote, or and the second part of that is, could you do things in fiction that you couldn't do in journalism if you wanted to say something?
Yes, that's a really good question, because your second question points to a problem that occurred with the first question. The first manuscript that I wrote also featured a reporter as a protagonist. I was going with write what you know, a phrase that a lot of people have heard, right, primarily because I was working a full-time job then as the European bureau chief of the Hollywood Reporter, and I didn't have a lot of time for research. I didn't have time to research a cop's life or a forensic pathologist's life. But I made the mistake, I would say, of being what I would call too accurate. I was so worried about describing exactly how things worked for this reporter as he proceeded to try and solve the crime that the manuscript was dead boring. I got an agent, it sold, no one wanted to buy it, no one should buy it, no one should read it. So when I started working on this series, having learned that lesson, the answer to your question is yes. When you write at least when you write a crime novel featuring a reporter, which is what I know best, there are a lot of things you have to do to make it a great story, where you break completely away from the reality of the world of journalism. My friend Dick Belsky is on this call. I saw him, and he and I often have this conversation. He was a managing editor, executive editor at the Daily News New York Post. The biggest example, and easiest one to give, is reporters don't chase down murderers. They don't catch murderers, right? They write about the arrest of murderers, but that wouldn't be a very interesting crime novel. So, what I try and do is bring in enough of the realism of what a reporter's life is like, doing interviews and, chasing leads, while cutting out all the boring bits. He's not covering zoning board meetings or anything like that, and adding in that part that makes it, a crime story where he is in the last act, in the last chapter, chasing down the bad guy.
Right, exactly. Right, because in your books, he is, Mr. Taylor is in very precarious situations frequently,
Yes.
life-threatening ones.
Yep.
So it does make for a very exciting narrative. I want to talk a bit about the setting of your books. These 4 books take place in the mid to late 1970s, New York City.
Yep.
Why did you decide to focus on that period? Why did you decide to start the series in that period?
Yeah. So I had an idea for a story, and ideas for stories are, if you talk to writers, they are all over the place. It could be the murder scene, it could be the victim, it could be, and mine was a what if. What if a really top-notch police reporter screwed up so badly he was demoted to the obituaries desk?
Right. So
I have my what if, and that's what Last Words is about, sort of him trying to get out of that hole. But then, and I've since learned, once I became published, that a lot of writers were doing this for a reason I'll explain. But I wanted to write a story where there would be payphones and fax machines. You'll see in a lot of modern crime fiction and even in movies, people have to go through lots of gymnastics to avoid the fact that everyone has a cell phone. Because it's like, why didn't you just call with the cell phone? Oh, there's no signal. That's typical in horror movies. It also happens in crime movies. I was doing something that I guess a lot of other writers were thinking about at the time. I didn't know it because I didn't know any other writers at the time. So I basically stepped back in time. I got to 1975, and I was at that time, I had started the novel, and we were involved in the Gulf Wars. So we were involved in 2 wars, and they weren't universally popular, and they were difficult. And I looked at 1975, and in 1975, the Vietnam War ended. Now, most people think it ended in 72 and we pulled out, but in 75, the North came over the line, took the South. You have the pictures of the helicopters on top of the embassy. And for that very simple reason, kind of a weak parallel to what was going on in my world at the time, I chose 75. I did not realize how much research I would end up having to do for that book or the next 3. And I also didn't realize kind of the gold mine I would uncover with, the bankruptcy of New York City, which paralleled the '08 crash. The subprime crash had a lot of parallels to what happened with New York City's debt. And then, of course, the final book, Lights Out Summer, I got to have Son of Sam be in the book right around the 40th anniversary of his reign of terror in New York City. So I was really just thinking, oh, this is a good year, and there's a bad war ending. I'll start here. And a lot of things happened because of that, but I didn't even know what happened.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting how you integrate the actual events of the time period into the story. I mean, they are part of the story. It's not just something extraneous. It is an integral part of the story. I think that's done very effectively.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I want to talk about your protagonist, Coleridge Taylor, who was an investigative reporter. And as Rich said in the first book, Last Words, he gets demoted to writing obituaries. But he's a very interesting character, I find. He's independent. He's a straight shooter. He's on the right side of issues at hand. But I found him also to be a very haunted character, haunted by the death of his brother in Vietnam, and by the difficult relationship that he has or had with his father. Tell us about Coleridge. How did you come up with the profile of this character?
Wow. So I knew I was starting out with, in writing, it's called The Hero's Wound. He's got a wound already in that, he's this top flight police reporter sitting on the obits desk where, I mean, maybe only a journalist could understand the trap, but he's writing about the dead, but he can't pursue what happened to them or why, even if perhaps there is, nefarious activities around a particular obituary. But then as you start writing, I mean, I knew he was going to be, let me put it this way, he's a much better reporter than I was. My career has a long list of different places I worked because I'm very curious and I tended to move around when I wanted to try something new. That's why there was a Peekskill Herald in my case. Eugene and Kathy can speak for their own cases. That's why I worked for the Hollywood Reporter. That's why I did websites. That's why I'm helping kids now run a newspaper website. This guy is laser focused on reporting, and not just that, police reporting. That's what he cares about. And there are people like that. And so that's kind of one-dimensional. So I kind of had to, as I started working him out, well, the Vietnam War is ending, and I wanted him to reflect on that, as most of the country doesn't care. Because in 75, most of the country, that helicopter shot made the front page of the Times, but most of the overrunning in the South, no one cared. It's the war we lost, and we never lose wars. So what a better way for him to reflect on it and feel pissed off as well as sad than to have lost a brother there in a war that no one gives a what about. Right. So that's how I added the brother. The complexity with the father. I wanted to write a New York story, but I did not want it to be a Manhattan or a Manhattan only story. I was born in Poughkeepsie. I've always felt myself an outsider anywhere. Even in Peekskill, I was a carpetbagger, but in New York, certainly. So I wanted him to come from Queens. I wanted him to come from a kind of blue collar background. It's not really one. His dad is a professor, but he's at CUNY. and he's a drunk. And I wanted to kind of create this picture of not a, a Columbia journalism grad school, Manhattan type of person. And I think that probably in part what it inspired it. I mean, some things in your life do inform your fiction, not everything. My dad was an alcoholic. He wasn't the kind of alcoholic that you read in that book, but I do know because my dad became an alcoholic, at least as far as I knew, when I was already an adult and out of the house. So I did not have to live through it as a child. My younger brothers and sisters did, but that may be TMI. But I kind of understood it, and he does have positive relationships. His girlfriend, certain journalists that he works with. So it's not all negative.
Right. You mentioned one thing that I think is a prevalent theme throughout your books, is that Coleridge Taylor he's concerned about the forgotten person, not just his brother who was forgotten, but
Right.
the people who don't make the front pages, and people, as you said, at first he's writing obituaries. It's just a name. That's all it is, really. He's concerned about the forgotten person who might be suffering a tragedy or something horrible. That's one of his themes. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was an interesting theme.
Yeah. I mean, there's two things going on with Taylor that, and one certainly preceded the political moment that we've been through in the last 4 years ish. Again, as I said, he is a much better journalist than I was. He's also very, very down the line. This is a guy who believes in facts. He believes if he assembles enough facts, then people will know what happened as best they can, and that's the deal. And I think I was coming to that because I was already living in the age of the internet and the Huffington Post and clickbait and making crap up and not even trying for a fact or half a fact. And so I gave him that as his thing. His thing about, he does believe, and I think it's a bit of a maybe, this is because Taylor and I are different people, but he does believe if he can tell someone's story, particularly if they're the ignored person, then there is some measure of justice there for that person. I think that's probably the strongest, and I probably blew that theme out in its biggest sense in the last book, because I read a lot about Son of Sam before there's not a lot of books, but I read what there were. And he was shooting, he was aiming for white girls. He was hitting white guys too, because they were dating. And so there were tons of cops assigned to this case. So I've never read anything like this, but I just assumed, well, if there were, then probably a lot of other cases weren't getting seen to. And so in Lights Out Summer, I decided he's a contrarian on top of everything else. He at this point, he's now working for a small wire service, not the newspaper he had been working for. He cannot chase the 25 people that the Post had on it, right, Dick? And the 30 people the Daily News had on it. So he decides to chase the story of someone murdered the same night as the victim in March, which is the first public victim, the first publicized victim, just only a couple blocks away in the same neighborhood in Queens. She happens to be African American. This is before any of this kind of stuff's going on now. She happens to be a maid who works on the Upper East Side, which led the story in a lot of different directions. That's probably where you see the scene, that kind of idea, the strongest. Part of it is the little guy should get their story. Part of it is kind of a contrarian nature. Part of it's kind of self-preservation. I'm going to sit here spending my life rewriting the Daily News and the New York Post unless I find something different to cover.
Right. Definitely. I've also noticed that your books, not just to expand on the ignored population or the marginalized groups, you do focus on homeless people in your novels and how they're treated, and other innocent people who are victimized by circumstances. And I think that's I know you sort of were talking about that, but I just wanted to mention that I think that's an interesting theme that runs through your books, which
Yeah, I mean, I don't think our homeless problem hasn't really changed since the 70s, but it just was so much more obvious. You know, as if you went down to Alphabet City, you're gonna see it. So I kind of felt that those characters should be in there.
now, and that leads me right to my next question about the issues of the 70s and the issues now. These issues are still with us. Some are, some more visible than they were then, but these issues are still prevalent. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, 30 years after the time period of books, these same issues, drug addiction, homelessness, violence, issues with police, corruption, are still with us, possibly worse than before. But these issues are still here. These books may take place in the 70s, but the themes are here and now.
Yeah. Well, there was originally going to be a fifth book, and I researched it, and and decided not to do it. But I bring it up first because it's another thing people have forgotten. It was going to be called Bad Weather, and it was going to be about the domestic terror campaign run by the Weathermen and the Black Liberation Army. Although I was going to have to, as you do in these things, there is verisimilitude, but sometimes you have to juggle to make the story work. In the early 70s, there were roughly, in a 3 or 4 year period, an average of 1,000 domestic bombings a year. Yeah, your eyebrows went up. Now, they often were at night, and they always phoned ahead, so it was different, sort of. But I think of now how we all freak out, the impact that 9/11 had on, and obviously, 3,000 people died there. Even though that bombing campaign set off a lot more bombs, far fewer people died. But it's completely forgotten that was going on, that scary thing was going on in our lives. In terms of the issues, I mean, certainly issues with race. I mean, they were happening then. I mean, they were happening before then in the late 60s. They were happening before then in the 50s. I mean, I don't know how we forgot or fell asleep so that we had to wake up. But I mean, I was certainly aware that it was a time where those things were going on. One thing that I'll mention, which might seem a more minor point, but is a big one for me, in the middle of, well, this is a small spoiler, it won't really ruin anybody's day, but in the middle of a book, you're supposed to do something at the midpoint, usually maybe kill somebody. And in the middle of book 2, I decided rather than to kill a person, I would kill off the newspaper that Taylor was then working at. Right. This came as a surprise to me because I didn't have plans for where he would work after this. But I was at the time sort of subconsciously and consciously, there's this general idea that the internet killed off all these newspapers. Newspapers have been dying since Eyewitness News came on. When there was evening news, afternoon papers started dying, including the Evening Star here in Peekskill. They've been dying. There were 8 newspapers in the early 60s in New York. We were down to 3 in the 70s. I made it 4 by creating another one because I wanted, that sort of a bit of that feel. But sort of delivering that message of this has been going on a long time. It just got worse and accelerated with the internet, and it sure has accelerated. I guess it's 1,800 newspapers since 2004 have gone under, and that's really not local newspapers. That's really not good. The other stuff, I mean, corruption. I think we're never going to get rid of that. And that's kind of where the 1,800 newspapers going under. That's 1,800 local municipalities, villages, towns, and cities not being covered. Someone else has forecast in about 10 years, we're going to hear about a giant wave of municipal corruption because there's nobody covering these places. There's nobody in the media. There's nobody asking what's going on. Yeah, so I don't know. There's a whole lot of different social issues you could talk about. Some things have gotten better. Some things are the same, and we kind of forgot that they weren't.
Right. Coleridge Taylor, and you mentioned this before, his focus are facts. He's looking for facts, and he likes to quote John Adams. And the quote by John Adams is that facts are stubborn things. And I'd like to get your thoughts on the media the last few years or so. We've heard terms like fake news, hoaxes. We've had a proliferation of online media, some by professionals, some by maybe amateurs. Facts are important. What's going on in this country with the media? What's your take on all this?
Oh gosh,
Broad question about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wouldn't declare a full-blown crisis. I mean, I think the loss of 1,800 local papers is bad. 400 local news websites have started in the same period that are members of the organization that I'm a member of, the Pelham Examiner. So there's kind of a balancing. I think that
it's all one lot right now. Yes.
I think that the reader. I mean, the reader is not stupid. The reader is smart. I think the reader needs to be given the story. I mean, I'm all about facts because I think you need to tell the reader what happened before you tell the reader what to think about it, or what your opinion is, or what your news analysis of it is. And if you properly label each of those elements, I mean, I may be a poor person to ask about this because, you know, I get my news from print newspapers, NPR. I don't watch, the only time I ever watched cable news is when I worked in cable news. On the web, it would be the websites of trusted news sources. And I got 30 years experience. I know what those are. I think my biggest worry, and I see this even with the Pelham Examiner, the student-run paper drives a lot of traffic using Facebook groups in Pelham that parents and moms and dads are a member of. And, you know, people read a headline on Facebook and immediately start quoting it without seeing where it came from, sharing it, quoting it, talking about it. And we don't have media literacy courses in high school or college to the extent you actually need now to really drill down into, as a good example, a fake Russian post to realize, oh yeah, that's coming from somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about.
Do you think that, as we see in your novels, Coleridge Taylor he does a lot of gritty legwork. He pursues the story. Do you think today's journalists do that, or do you think they should do more of that?
Well, I mean, Coleridge has an unfair example in that I'm making a story with him, so I've got to get him on the move. I mean, as a reporter, I used the phone a great deal more than I ran around places. And when I was running around places up here in northern Westchester, it was to attend, the Lakeland School Board meeting or the Putnam Valley Town Board meeting. I mean, the journalism that I see, and I mean, if I extend it beyond newspapers, I mean, I read magazines, I read Mother Jones because I want to see what that take on it is, and the tech guy that owns the New Republic has crippled it, and The Nation is too one note for me, and Mother Jones does journalism with a bias, but they're doing reporting, not just telling me what I should think. I guess if I were to pick one thing I don't like about journalism now, and I have to work with the kids on this, is they often will default to doing an interview using email. And this has it's very easy for both parties, but it has two problems. One, I can tell a quote that's done by an email interview because it's too perfect to can quote.
Exactly. Right.
It's got a semicolon in it. No one uses semicolons in speech. Um, and when you do an email interview, there's no chance for the follow-up question.
That's
And the follow-up question isn't necessarily, the attack or the, oh, you're wrong, tell me this. The follow-up question could be they just, oh, yeah. And then when I was, you're talking to a chef. And then when I was working on as a seaman on a tanker, blah, blah, blah. And then he moves on and like, oh my gosh, there's a whole side to this profile I'm writing that you either have to send a second set of email questions back, far easier to do it. But it's, everybody, including the people that cover the White House, they're all doing it by text, they're all doing it by email. I think that creates a wall of ease for both parties. And it would be better if maybe at the least, and I'm now talking about what would be defined as print reporters, which include anybody who's working on a website where it's words and pictures, not moving pictures, did more phone interviews than use just electronic devices to get their quotes.
In one of the early books, there was Taylor was commenting on the ownership of one of the papers, and that the owners hadn't really paid their journalistic dues. They owned it. Do you think that's an issue in today's journalism?
I actually, I don't know if you saw it, the Sunday Times last weekend, the weekend before last, the cover of the business section was what's happening to your local paper or your paper. One was a massively long piece on the disturbances inside the Wall Street Journal. And the Times and the Journal spend a lot of time covering the disturbances inside each other. But the other one was, it's basically, here's the billionaire who's probably going to own your local paper. Mm-hmm. And, there's a billionaire who owns the Philly Inquirer and put it into a nonprofit. A billionaire may end up with the Baltimore paper. A billionaire owns the LA paper. I'm actually kind of thankful for these billionaires because the alternative is a couple of three hedge funds that are buying up papers and then just strip mining them down to almost nothing. So I really don't care about the qualification. Katharine Graham was never a journalist and she was a great publisher and took on the president of the United States. I don't really care about their journalistic credentials. I care about whether they care to keep a news operation in business anymore.
I want to go back to Coleridge Taylor for a second. What I found interesting, among other things, is that he's in 4 books and he's lived in 4 different boroughs of New York City. Each book he's living in a different borough, which I thought was very clever. He's lived in Manhattan, he's lived in the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. Did you intend to do that? He sort of moves around a lot. He's in.
It was not a plan until the second book when I moved him into Manhattan, even though I didn't want him to be Manhattan. Was it the second book I moved in Manhattan? Anyway, when I moved him the first time, I started to think, you know what? Maybe I'll have him live in and I have to announce now the main reason I decided not to write the book is because he was going to have to live in Staten Island, and I just didn't want to have to research it. I'm kidding. I'm joking. I'm not making fun of Staten Island, even if I am. But in the 5th book, he was going to have to live in Staten Island, which was going to be, there are ways around. You just make the commute one sentence, but it kind of came to me. I think in book 2 or book 3 that he'd be a bit of a gypsy, and I'd put him in each of the boroughs.
He also has a very close relative. Obviously, he's had difficulty with his father, but one of his other relatives runs a diner in Manhattan.
Yes.
That surfaces in all books, and it's sort of a place of, I wouldn't say necessarily calmness, but a brief respite from what he's dealing with.
Right.
What was the origins of that diner, which is affectionately nicknamed the Oddity in your book?
Right, because it's the Odysseus. I love New York coffee shops, and I love suburban kid. I love diners, and a New York coffee shop is a diner. It's, they're interchangeable, and so I wanted to have him have a place, and then I thought, well, maybe the place should be one where he's got a relative. So I made his late mother Greek Orthodox. And then I had to do a lot of research on that. Then I ended up cutting most of it out because I was getting obsessed with icons and things. And I was raised Roman Catholic, so I was like really, really going off on it. And a lot of it got junked, but his grandfather is still alive and runs the place. And yeah, it gives him, it gives him a place to stop in. It gives him, particularly before he starts going out with a woman in the newsroom in the first book, and it's fairly late in the book. It gives him, a sounding board and someone to talk to, because in the newsroom initially he's working for the obit editor who hates him, and then he's sent back to the cop shop, and they don't like him much because of what his perceived sin, which I'll mention because it goes. I guess it goes back to answer your question about hoaxes. The more things change, the more they don't.
Right.
He is accused. He actually writes a feature story about a 9-year-old heroin addict, and then he's accused of making the story up. The heroin addict disappears completely, can't be found. No trace of this story can be proved. And I borrowed that and fictionalized it from the Janet Cook affair, which occurred when I was in college in Washington, who made up a 8 or 9-year-old girl. She was a girl heroin addict, wrote these beautiful, amazing stories about this girl's life that covered pages in the Washington Post, totally invented. And then the Washington Post ombudsman had to write, I still remember it, write an examination of what occurred, and it being the Post and the Times take this stuff seriously. The evaluation of how this occurred was longer than the actual stories on that Janet Cook wrote. So, you're talking about hoaxes now, or people making stuff up now. I mean, it's been going on forever in journalism. There are going to be charlatans in every business. I don't even like to say the term fake news because because the president normalized it or made it a term, someone can spit it out so quickly that you can't even get them to explain to you which fact in the story they have an argument with, that the sun rose, or that the 10 died in the accident, or whatever. So, but there have been hoaxes in the past too.
With the onset of, well, actually, this is a two-part question. For a while now, for many years, we've had a 24-hour news cycle. And now we have online news. What do you see are the advantages and the disadvantages in today's world now, in 2021, with a 24-hour news cycle? Do you think that news organizations have to fill the time? Do they have to? Well, that's my question. And are there any drawbacks to that? Or are there any advantages to it?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any. I mean, I don't think there's any disadvantage to being able to communicate quickly. My career at CNN was pretty early on in its run, before it had any competitors. So, we were 24 hours a day. I was a junior person there. We're inventing 24-hour news. Until then, you waited until Uncle Walter came on and you got the news. And then maybe you were lucky enough to live in a town with 2 editions of the newspaper, a morning and an afternoon newspaper. And, even back then, CNN had a problem, because when there wasn't a riot or a plane crash, people just had to sit there and talk about stuff. And then once there were 3 of them, whatever you think about their different political positions, it quickly gravitated to talking about politics, because that's where you can get a panel of 5 people to scream at each other. I don't watch any of that stuff very often. I only turn it on when the last time I watched cable news was on January the 6th. I think, with the web, email, electronically, our brains work very fast, but you can only write even a single sentence that is accurate, correct, and punctuated so quickly. And people do punch out alerts that are wrong, that might maybe use a word in the alert that's not precise enough, or that is inaccurate. And there is the pressure even amongst the, traditional media like the Post and the Times, the Washington Post and the Times, to get their alerts out because they want to keep you as their digital reader. And so, I mean, I would never say, okay, stand back and take 5 minutes, because no one's ever going to do that. But, there is some equation that determines how fast you can actually write an accurate sentence and press send. And if you're going faster than that, there's probably a problem.
Right. I want to jump back to Coleridge. You mentioned that you had the idea for a fifth book. Will we see Coleridge again? Will he enter the 1980s?
Yeah. I was gonna. I had a 4-book deal, and then I had a 2-book deal added on. So I was going to take him to the 80s, and then inside baseball. But I needed to get a new literary agent, and the publishing house wouldn't give me a year break between 4 and 5 to do that. To finish a project, because you can't go to an agent with a new agent with something that you've already sold. So the Taylor series, Camel owns it, and Camel would own anything that were ever to be written after, if they were ever to come back. So that won't happen. So I don't think Taylor will come back. I have on submission to agents now, which is the first hurdle in the multi-hurdle marathon of book publishing, a book called The Bone Records, which is set in Coney Island in the summer of 2016, right up until the day before Election Day. A protagonist who's he's younger than Taylor. He's an NYPD Academy washout whose Russian immigrant father is murdered, and left on his body is back in the late 40s until the early 60s. The only way that Russians could listen to Western music was on records cut from used X-rays. This is true. This is not fiction. And they were called bone records. There's a couple sites. There's not a lot out there about them. And a bone record is left on his father's body. And so he is pursuing this as it becomes clearer that his own life and his former girlfriend's life is threatened. And anyway, that's the Bone Records. I'm right now writing in the midst of, because the deal with submitting is you submit, and you get rejected, and you submit, you get rejected, and you wait some more. And if you're not doing something else, you'll jump off a building. So I'm writing I'm writing the book that is requiring the least research of me. I decided to go for something that I think is high concept, because I think sometimes I go a little low concept, and that may be one of the issues in attracting more interest. It's called The Au Pairs. It's set in a Westchester town called Greeley Manor, which is located, in my imagination, somewhere between Pelham and Dobbs Ferry. And it's about 3 au pairs, although one is murdered in the first chapter, and then the other 2 of them, one of whom is threatened and is trying to figure out what's going on. And I say it's easy to research because it's set now in a place kind of like where I live, with the people kind of like the people that surround me. So
Okay.
We'll see what happens with that. And I have, gosh knows what will happen to them, but I have a file of 35 or 40 ideas. I worked this summer on an idea that I got a quarter of the way through, and I realized it was nice, but it was too generic. It was a PI detective story, but it didn't have enough going on. So I have a lot of other ideas that, you have to write them first, and then you have to hope something happens.
Right. Coleridge loves Rolling Rock and CBGBs and the Ramones. Do you, or did you?
Yeah. Well, I am not so cool that I knew who the Ramones were in '75.
Okay.
I was in, that was my sophomore year of high school. Okay. So I will admit, listening to Billy Joel and trying not, and Meatloaf and Boston, and trying not to listen to any disco, Foreigner or Styx, which my colleagues in high school were listening to. But I got into college, and by 82, 83, the new wave had come in, the Police.
Mhm.
And because of the new wave, I then backed into the original punk wave, which was, of course, you know, I mean, Lou Reed played at CBGB also. The double bill that I have there of Patti Smith and the Ramones, they were often a double bill at CBGB. I looked that up. And so I wanted, you know, I mean, you can call up into people's minds, you know, the whole writing thing is try and use other senses rather than sight, what people see. And so while you can't use lyrics, I can't, they cost too much. Michael Connolly can, but even a song title and a description of how that song went, or an album title. You know, I'm a very big Springsteen fan, and that was from late in my high school. So in the second 75 book, you know, Born to Run came out in August 75. I was able to work that in. Those titles, you know, if people cared, those songs go into their head, and it helps set the time.
You mentioned earlier, my first question actually, about the first answer about what inspired you to go into crime and mystery writing. You mentioned the Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, things like that. Can you talk about your other influences, other writing, other authors who you enjoy, who
Sure.
in the crime mystery field, whether they're 100 years ago or contemporary?
Sure. Moving forward in time, I was when I started that first novel that went nowhere. I was reading a lot of Tony Hillerman, the Joe Newport and Jimmy Choo mysteries. He's dead now, and I don't think he's read as much as he should be. But I was fascinated with the way he made the Southwest, the Navajo reservation, a character in those stories. And there's a way you make description a character, and there's a way you make it very boring and you don't want to read it. And one of my mantras, if you want to call it that, in writing the New York books was, I wanted, even though the Southwest and New York have nothing to do with each other, I wanted New York to be a character in my books in the same way that the Navajo tribal reservation was. A huge go-to for me is Michael Connolly, the Bosch series, partly because, you know, he's a journalist who converted to novel writing, though I got to say I did a bit of crime writing in my career, and it was here in Peekskill mainly early in my career. He was a major crime writer in Denver and LA. But I love his books. I love his books because for a lot of reasons, but I you know, there are people that I can name like James Elroy, who have this incredibly jazzy voice. Connolly doesn't seem to have a voice. You might think it's journalistic writing, though if it were, it would be boring after 2 pages and you'd stop, because you're reading and then suddenly he's got you and you don't even notice. And although I don't copy the way he writes, that's kind of the way I think of the kind of voice that I like to write with, that it's, you know, it's getting you without the flares, mainly because I don't know how to do the flares, you know. A recent discovery, as old as it may be, I'm not a Holmes guy, which will probably get me hated, but Penguin is reissuing new translations in paperback of all the Maigret mysteries. That's the French detective. He's the number one detective in French literature, and they're all exactly 153 pages long. There's 170 of them. Yeah. And, you know, I hadn't read them and I bought them, and, you know, this is stereotyping, but I expect from the French sort of a more flair, upper class or whatever. And these are very blue collar. They're the kind of, they're the reason I read, you know, Raymond Chandler or Connolly. They're hard boiled. They're down in the dirt. and I don't know that you could write this character now because of, every agent wants you to have a voice, and your character has to have 9 different wounds and problems and issues, and maybe an ADHD and some dyslexia, and Inspector Maigret has no problems. He goes home to his wife, who makes great cassoulets. He's this big man. He's undaunted when he's doing an investigation. All the people around him have all kinds of problems, and he's just this brilliant center for these stories. If no one has tried them, I'd recommend one of those Penguin reissues.
It's funny you mentioned that series because I recently discovered that character in that series as well. I was reading a book, I forget who was by, but the author mentioned the series by Georges Simenon, featuring this inspector, and said that he had written many novels in this series. I had not heard of them, so I picked up a few last year, and they are very interesting. I would also recommend other people discovering those books. If anybody has any questions for Rich, you can put them in the chat, or we can unmute you. Just fire away. I wanted to say that Rich's 4 books are available from the Friends of the Field Library. You can email friendsofthefield@gmail.com if you would like to get both our books. Rich can sign them for you, a standard autograph or a personalized one.
Yeah, if you'd like them, if you'd like a 2 Fred, please say so. Because if I don't see that, I don't. Because some people want to give them as gifts, a few, my family, or want to sell them on eBay for probably less than they bought them for. But if you do want a 2, make sure you put that in the email, or I won't. I'll just, write enjoy and put my signature on it.
We have a question. Rich, which book did you most enjoy writing?
Oh, I think almost every author says their last one. I mean, it's so great to have a book out, and it's been 4 years. My last book, Lights Out Summer, when I was approaching it, the other 3 did have history in them. They had the punk rock and the CBGBs. There's Lights Out Summer, and they had things going on. They had the Drop Dead Punk has New York City going bankrupt, but I was dancing around that a little bit because the finance stuff would get too boring. A Black Sail was 1976, so it had the ships coming up the Hudson River for the bicentennial, and that was really just a set piece in the middle of the book. That wasn't. There were some things, but not. It was a bit. But with Lights Out Summer, I was really a bit worried because it was 77, which meant Son of Sam. He started killing people in July of 76, but the police made the first linkage in March 10th of 1977. And I was going to start the book at that press conference. And so I knew that I was going to have to, because Taylor is going to still have to cover the story, even though he's going to get beat all the time. He's got to care about it, or he wouldn't be a real journalist. He was going to have to dance around that story, giving people fill-ins and what's going on. And I was going to have to do that in a way so they didn't get so interested in the Son of Sam story. We're talking a serial killer story here, which is the most popular, or some of the most popular kind of crime fiction out there, and still be interested in the story that I was telling. And I was really worried about that. And so when I typed the end and on the 5th revision and it seemed to be working, I was very happy with it. And I will add as the PS, that book was named it got the Shamus Award for Best Paperback Private Eye Novel in 2018 from the Private Eye Writers of America. So I, in retrospect, also find that to be my favorite book.
Yeah. We have another question. When will the series be available on Netflix or Hulu or Amazon Prime?
When my brother gets his law degree, starts a talent agency and negotiates the deal for me. Thanks, Tom.
It's funny because your descriptions are very vivid. It is very cinematic.
Yeah.
I think your books. I think they would be very. I think it would be a great film series. They're very cinematic.
I mean, it took Michael Connolly, who's every book now when it comes out is automatic bestseller, automatic #1. It took him 16 books to get a TV deal. You have to be a bestseller to get a TV deal, almost. I mean, there are a few where some actor or director falls in love with the story of a book people haven't heard about, but by and large, you have to sell a ton of books to get a TV deal. I'd be happy right now to get another publishing deal. That make me very happy.
Another question. As someone, in a comment, as someone who was part of the New York City media during the Summer of Sam, I was impressed by how dead on you were with your description of that period. How hard was it to make sure you didn't get anything wrong?
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was really worried about that. For example, it opens with that press conference, and I could not find where exactly it had been held. All my looking and searching, so I decided to have it be held in the there's a precinct that also is the Detective Command Center in Queens, where they had centralized the investigation, and I decided to do it there. I lived in fear that someone would come out and say, no, it wasn't there, it was at One Police Plaza or whatever. Other things, you knew where the murders happened, you knew what the papers were saying, you knew where the papers were located. But there's a point at which, you're trying to, where you hope you've created enough suspension of disbelief or verisimilitude that when you have to make something up, or you have to move a building, or you have to have something happen somewhere else, you do it. What I would never do, for example, and that was the challenge in this book, is, everyone or anyone who cares about the case knows how Son of Sam was caught, a parking ticket in Brooklyn that led to his house in Yonkers. I could not have my guy catch Son of Sam or be anywhere near that. So I knew where not to go. And I was hoping that the stuff that I was guessing at would be real enough for people.
Excellent. I want to hold up a copy of each of Richard's books in chronological order, just so we can show them.
Wow,
first.
awesome.
I want to make sure people see this. Last Words is the first one in the series. Next, we have Drop Dead Funk. And then the third in the series, well, that's not the third, this is this third. The Black Sail is the third in the series. And then the fourth one, Lights Out Summer, which I displayed before. They're excellent. I recommend all of them. Coleridge Taylor is a fascinating character. So if there are no more comments or questions, I would like to thank Rich so much for visiting with us. And we'll be in touch. Thank you again. Thank you for being in the Birdsall House. Thank you for being a Peekskill. And
Thank you, Peekskill, for getting me started. And it's a pleasure to be back.
Great. And I'd like to thank everybody who attended tonight. Thank you so much. And we appreciate your support of the Friends of the Field Library. And I wish you all a very good night. Thank you again, Rich. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Have a good night, everybody.
I'm going to wait for everybody. I hate goodbyes.
I know. We'll see you again.
Yes.
Yeah.